Well, hello and welcome to week 3 of Advanced PHP. So what I'm going to cover in this screencast is a review of how to make classes. So a little intro review of object-oriented programming with creating classes. And I'm going to add into that something a little new. PHP has these methods called magic methods, and there's a, a bunch of different ones. So there's magic methods that are for getters and setters, and then there's magic methods that are for constructors and destructors, and there's also a magic method that works just like the Java toString. Okay, so a little review first. Let me go ahead and bring up the file browser here. And I'm going to go to the HTML folder, demos, week 3, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it class review and magic methods. All right, so that's our folder, class review and magic methods. And then what I want to do is I'm going to create just a simple a class called student, and a student will have like an ID, a name, and an email, and then we'll just simply use it. And so some of this is going to be review, and then I'm going to introduce a little bit about magic methods, how we use them in PHP, and you'll definitely get my opinion about should I use magic methods, should I not use magic methods, why or why not, which ones are good, which ones should I consider maybe not using. Okay, so let me bring up the editor here, and I will create a class file. And if you remember in PHP, let's just start with the PHP opening and closing tags, and we will, when we create a class, we're going to use the keyword class, and let's say we want to call this a student class. It's called Studley caps because we're starting the word with a capital letter as opposed to camel case, which starts the first word with a lowercase letter, and then each subsequent word has the first letter capitalized. All right, so student, and then that's our opening class. So let me save that. And if you remember from PHP, you don't have to call this the name of the class. In Java does enforce that, enforces you to save your class files with the same name. However, professionally in PHP, I have no idea why you would ever want to name your class other than the name of your class. I suppose if you wanted to put multiple classes in the same script file, but that's really not a good practice. So if you want to follow professional practices, name your PHP script the exact same name of your class. And if I were to hit save, this is going to go into my home folder. We don't want it to go there, so we want it to go to HTML, demos, week 3, class review, and magic methods. So I will save that. There we go, and I've got my color highlighting. Okay, so simple class. If we wanted to keep this super simple, and I wanted to give access to my instance variables, if you remember from last semester when I introduced you to object-oriented coding using classes, we use it primarily as a way to organize our code. You want to think of a class as representing a thing. I used the example last semester of a radio. You want to think all classes know something, which is your data. And so in the case of a radio, that might be it's going to know what the volume is, whether it's on or off, what channel or frequency it is. And then all classes do something. So in that particular case, you want to be able to turn the radio on or off, change its volume, or change its channel. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and, since this is a student we're dealing with, we could really simply say public ID. Now, if you remember, these are accessibility labels. What this means is that anybody inside or outside of the class has access to this instance variable, and our instance variables will typically go up at the top of a class. So I'm going to say public $name for the student's name, public $email for the student's email. Okay, that's my real simple class. So let's say I would like to maybe use my class. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll create another script file. And I'm going to call this script file use student.php. All right. And then if we want to use our class file, we'll have to include it. And we always like to use the require once statement. That will make sure you only include it once. And since it's located in the same path, we'll just give it the name of the file right there. So we're going to say require once. And if you remember, if we want to instantiate a class, we're going to have to use the new keyword. So remember, classes are a template. They're used for creating one or more objects, which is mostly true if you remember from the end of your intro to object-oriented programming with Java. You used the static keyword, and there's many classes in the, for example, the math library that are static methods. And so you don't really have to instantiate that class to use it. You can actually just, anytime there's a static method, you can call it, prefacing it with the class name, and then using the class scoping operator, which is the double colon. Okay, so objects of a particular class are instantiated. You can create multiple instances of a class, and each instance is unique and has its own copy of the instance variable. So the example code I'm going to write is hopefully going to touch on all of this. All right, so we created student.php, use student.php. Let's go ahead and instantiate two students. All right, so I'm going to create a variable called Jane, set it equal to new student, and then we're just going to put the open and close parentheses. So Jane is a unique instance of a student. And then we'll create another variable called John, instantiate John using the new keyword, student. John is a unique instance of a student. Okay, so if you recall here, I have public access to these things, right? So with public access to instance variables, we would set the value of Jane's ID using this mechanism right here. Okay, so the dash and the right angle bracket, and we'll say ID equals 1 and John's ID equals 2, and we'll set Jane's name equal to Jane and John's name equal to John. And then let's go ahead and echo out, say Jane name, and then we'll put an apostrophe S here. Oh, it looks kind of ugly. Student ID is $Jane ID. And then we'll put a line break, And then we're using double quotes, so we can do this. What we're doing here is variable interpolation, right? Okay, and then we'll do the same thing for John. I'm just going to copy and paste. And we'll change that to John and that to John. And if all goes well, we can run this. So I'm going to bring up the browser. And we'll go to localhost, demos, get spelled correctly. And we'll go into week 3. And let's see if we got any errors. Well, look at that. Okay, so we get the correct output. Here's the problem. And you know what the problem is. We're violating one of the very important principles of object-oriented programming. We are violating the principle of encapsulation because I have no idea who is messing with this thing, right? So what we really want to do is we want to, if we're going to enforce the idea of encapsulation, we only want to modify these methods within the class. And we only want to give access to, we want to modify the instance variables through methods in the class, and we want to give access to the instance variables only through methods. So what we do to do that is we change all of these to private, right? And then we have to add getters and setters, right? Okay, so I will add some getters and setters here. So that would, we'll just put a comment here, getters, setters, and then we want to give public access to these methods. So another term for these getters and setters could be public accessor methods. So we use the keyword function to create a method, and the formula we use would be we use camel case, we say get for our getters, and then we capitalize the first letter of the instance variable that we're dealing with. In this particular case, it would be ID. Okay, so capital I and D, open and close parentheses, and then we'll say return $ this, and then ID. Now, incidentally, I know that in your Java class, you don't have to use this keyword, okay? You could just do this, right? And that works in Java. It does not work in PHP, okay? There's also another problem with not using the this keyword. So sort of, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit. Let me address this when I deal with the setter. So let me create the setter. Okay, so public function set ID, which is going to take a single parameter, and we can just say ID right here, and then we will say $this ID, ID equals $ID. Okay, and so that's the proper way to do this, and you're required to use this keyword in PHP. Now let's say you're working in Java. Now I know this isn't Java, but I'm just going to simulate this. Let's say, well, I just want to use ID because maybe that's how you learned it. Well, this isn't going to work because you have to change the name of this, right? So we end up doing kind of silly things like we'll say things like in ID for our incoming ID, and then we have to do this, right? We'll have to say in ID. But see, there's another problem. Imagine, if you will, that you have a class and you have a bunch of instance variables, and maybe your methods are doing a little, I don't know, maybe they're not getters and setters necessarily, but you're maybe doing some range checking. By using the this keyword, let me just back all this out. By using the this keyword, you're removing any ambiguity to the developer that comes after you that you're talking about the instance variable of this class. That's super important. You don't need any extra documentation. I don't have to go hunting to say, hey, is this an instance variable or is this a local variable? So in my opinion, whether this is Java or PHP, .NET or whatever, and PHP requires it, so you don't have a choice. But if you're programming in Java, I think it's always a good idea to use this keyword. It's better for code maintainability, and it reduces what I like to call as technical debt. Okay, so off my rant on that one. So we've got a getter and a setter for the ID. Let's create a public function. Oops, spell it correctly. Get name. So we're going to return $this name, and then we'll deal with our setters. Public function set, well, our setter for the name, and then I obviously need to pass in a parameter here, so put name in there, and then we're going to just say $this name equals $name. Then we'll create one more set for our email. Public function get email. Return $this email. Then setter public function set email $email, and we'll say $this email equals $email. All right. So I'm just gonna, before I do any modifications in my use student, I just want to see if I have any errors, and yes, I do. So let's see what those are. Okay. It says uncaught error, cannot access private property student ID in use student PHP. Well, of course we're going to get that error, right? Why are we going to get that error? Because we have to rewrite this because we can't get access to it, right? So that's what we should get. But it doesn't look like I have any syntax errors in student class just yet. So we'll find out. All right, so we got to fix this, right? So all this is okay. I'm just going to comment these lines of code out right here. And all right. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to call the setter set ID. We'll set that to, we'll just start with 3. And then for John, set ID 4. And then we'll set their names. Jane, set name, Jane. And then John, set name, John. And then let's figure out what we got to do for the change these echoes. Okay, and then I'm going to say, I think, you know what I want to do? Let's just do this because this will make the comments a lot easier to deal with. Okay, let's get rid of that. We'll move these down here, and then we'll get rid of these. Put that down there, and then what we'll do is we'll create a new comment, say with encapsulation using getters, setters. Okay, then we'll go ahead and grab this right here. We'll deal with one of them. And let's fix it. All right, so here we're going to have to say set name, I'm sorry, get name. And because we're using variable interpolation and we want this all encapsulated, we actually need to do something a little special and put this entire call to the getName method with the object encapsulated with scoping operators, the curly brackets. All right, so we're going to do the same thing here. We'll say get ID, open and close parentheses, and then hopefully that's right because I'm going to copy and paste it and change that to John. Okay, John. And let's just see what we get. See if we've fixed everything. And we did. Okay, Jane's student ID is 3, John's student ID is 4. Okay. All right, so we got getters and setters at this point. Okay, so what I want to do at this point is switch gears and talk about these things in PHP called magic methods. And again, there's several kinds. There's the ones that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on right now are the magic getters and setters. These are the ones that I think are dubious. Okay, so I'm going to close the editor right here, and then I'm going to go to, let's back that up right there. Let's go to my file browser. I'm going to copy these two. Let's see. Oh, can I do that? Or can I just say, let's just say copy, or well, let's do that. It doesn't work. Okay, Control C, Control V, there we go. Control C, Control V. All right, and I'm going to rename student. Let's find the rename. I guess that's F2. Does F2 work on my Mac? We'll find out. It does. All right. Okay, let's rename this to Student Magic. And then let's rename this to Use Student Magic. There we go. All right, now what I want to do is we'll bring up the Student Magic file and the Use Student Magic file. Okay, let's go to Student Magic. Let's change the name to Student Magic. And before we do anything, we're going to make sure all this stuff works. Okay, save that. And then we're going to change the include to Student Magic .php, and then these instantiated classes will be Student Magic and Student Magic. Let's save that. Let's go and run that and run Use Student Magic, and that's awesome. Everything should be working as we would expect here. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to go ahead and let's see. I'm going to delete this for now. Let's do that. And I'm going to change this comment with, I'll change that to be with magic methods. How's that? Oh, using magic methods. Using magic getters, setters, or just say magic, getters, setters. You'll get the idea. All right, we'll leave it like that. Nothing's going on. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete all of these getters and setters and show you, when I show this to you, you're going to go, wow, this is really cool. And it is really cool if it worked. So let's change this to magic getters and setters, because that's what they are. All right, this is kind of cool. So to create, let's start with a magic getter. Public function. Magic methods or any reserved, magic variables start in PHP with an underscore. Methods or reserved methods or functions start with 2 underscores. So we're going to say double underscore get. And normally, when you create a getter, you don't pass any parameters. However, the magic getter works for all of the instance variables. So what we need to do is we need to actually say which instance, we need a variable that represents any of these instance variables. So it is a common convention in PHP to name that ivar for instance variable. Okay, and then I'll comment this out or add some comments here to sort of explain what's going on. So what we're going to want to do is return the, we're going to say $this, and then you would normally say like ID, right? But no, we're going to say $ivar, because what this will do is, here's why they're called magic methods, is when the get method is called here, the magic get method, it's going to go ahead and unpack. It sees this $sign right here, and it's going to unpack this ivar, and then it's as if it's going to go ahead and put ID after this if you passed in ID or name or email. Okay, which is pretty cool. So let me just see if I can write a little comment on here on what's going on. So this can be, or ivar can be equal to ID, name, or email. And then let me add a comment here. Normally, we would not use $sign after this. Let's see. Yep. ivar will evaluate to an expression equal to ID, name, or email. Okay, so likewise, we create a magic setter. So it stands to reason that if we're going to need 1 parameter for the magic getter, we're going to need 2 parameters for the magic setter. So we will need the instance variable, so we'll set that to ivar, and then we're going to also need whatever the value is. So we'll just use value here. And this is going to get set to, we'll just say this $ivar is equal to $value. Okay, so couple of things. This is what's called syntactic sugar, which means it's syntactic sugar. If you were to Google that, and you need to Google it in the context of programming, it's basically a shortcut method in programming that saves you time. Okay, so the idea here is the people who submitted this to the standards board on, the people who, or developers who submitted this change to the PHP language on the standards board, or to the standards board, said, hey, if you have a database table with 40 fields in it, do you really want to write 40 getters and 40 setters? Now, that's a separate issue, which what I've done previously is I've actually fired up Atom, and you can just install a plugin for getters and setters, and they will generate automatically. Pretty much any editor, you can find a plugin that will generate getters and setters automatically for you based on your instance variables right here. And they're usually customizable to what you want to put in there, like maybe some comments or whatever. So I don't really buy that argument. Okay. The other thing is that it would be great because C#.net has a mechanism for getting and setting properties using something similar, but their syntactic sugars, their magic getters or setters, if you will, which they call properties, works. I will show you some of the problems here. Okay, so let's see what we need to do to make this work. All right, when using magic getters and setters, let me save that. What we need to do is we actually need to address the we need to access the data using the same mechanism as if it were a public instance variable. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to uncomment this. And we are on, what, 5 and 6, I believe. 5 and 6. And then we'll go ahead and echo these out right here. Okay, excellent. So let's run that and just see if that works. And it does. Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, that's kind of cool. Well, what happens if I have an instance variable that is public? Can I do that? Let's go back to here. Let's see what happens when we change this one to public. Well, it's gonna, let's just see. It doesn't change, it works. Okay, I'm gonna address this in a little bit. This issue, it seems kind of a mystery, right? How do I know that I'm running the magic getter or setter? Well, long story short is if these are private and you have a magic getter and setter, then you are running the magic getter and setter. I could, for example, let's do this. Let's, in fact, we'll revisit this in a second. Let me put this, let me echo something out on the magic setter to see if I can sort of dispel this mystery for you here. Okay, so we'll say echo, we'll just echo out what we're setting, okay? And we're gonna say $ivar, $value, okay? And then let's go ahead and rerun this. Okay, so you can see we've called set ID 5, set ID 6, set name Jane, set name John. But let's go back and we'll change ID to public and rerun it. And now you can see that we're not using the magic getters and setters when we set this public. Okay. All right. I'm just gonna comment this echo statement out. All right. So some more problems using magic methods. Okay. Let's say, if you remember from the radio example last semester I said, what if you want to throttle the volume from, you don't want it to be less than 0 and you don't want it to be greater than 10. Well, let's just say, this is just kind of a silly educational example. Let's just say for student IDs, we don't want to go less than 0 and we don't want to go greater than 1,000. Okay? So what can we do in that particular case? Well, we can, we need to add what I would call validation code, right? So range checking. All right, but let's just take a look at how we have to go about doing this. Now, at this point, we only want range checking for the ID. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to come to the top of the magic setter. I'm going to put a comment, and it'll say custom code for validating specific instance variables. All right, so the first thing I need is if condition, and we're only going to do this if ivar is equal to ID. I know it doesn't matter, but I'll just do single quotes here. All right. All right, so I got my condition here. Now I'm only going to get into this code. My goodness. I'm only going to get into this code if the caller of the function wants to set the ID instance variable. All right, so now we need to check the value, right? So if $value is less than 0, else if $value is greater than 1,000, what we'll do at this point is we'll just throttle the value if it's if the passed-in value is less than 0. We'll just say value equals 0, and then down here, if it's greater than 1,000, value equals 1,000. Okay, so then I'll just put, because can you imagine having range checking code for like, okay, hey, this is supposed to make my life easier if I have like 10, 15 instance variables and I need to put this range checking code in for all of my instance variables. All right, so I better put a comment here saying this is end if ID. Oops, but that's not a comment. What was I doing? All right, there we go. All right. Okay, excellent. Well, let's go ahead and modify John's ID. We'll just say, here, we'll copy this. We'll say John's ID is going to be 1006. Okay. All right, so let's run that and then see what we get. Look at that. So it worked as we would expect. It throttles it down to 1,000. Excellent. Okay, what do we want to do now? So I guess the point that I wanted to prove here is that validation code is kind of ugly. Okay, in Student Magic. All right. We'll do a slightly switching gears here, but we will be continuing to use these magic and getter setters. I want to talk about a magic method that we do want to use. All right, so if you remember from your Java class, how do you output the contents of your class? Well, you use a method called toString. In PHP, we actually need to say public function double underscore, because it's a magic method, to string. And let's go ahead and just fill in a blank function. What do we want to output? We would like to output something like this. We'll maybe the ID, maybe the name, and maybe the email. Okay. All right, so that's what we'd like our output to look like. Something somewhat nicely formatted. Okay. All right, so I don't know if you've heard of this, but we're going to use this function called sprintf, and we're just going to return the result in an sprintf. Now here's the thing: in Java, you've used println, and you've probably added format characters. Those format characters are are identical to the ones used in sprintf, and both of these functions are holdovers from the C programming language. Okay, so what do we want to do? We're going to output a string, okay, and every time we want one of these variables, ID, name, or email, we're going to use a special format character, which is the % and an S. That means that's a string. All right, so what do we want? We want ID, and then I'm going to hit the tab twice, and then we'll say %S, and then we'll do a line break, and then we'll say name, tab, %S, and then a line break, and then email, a tab, and a %S. And do we want another line break? Sure, why not? Okay, and then after here, we're going to put our comma. We're going to put a comma, and then we need 1, 2, 3 variables. All right. So since I'm continuing this line, I'm going to double indent because that's part of the coding standards. And then I'm just going to say, let's do it this way. This ID, this name, and this email. Okay, we'll save that. Let's go back to use student magic. Okay, all right. So if we want to output this information, we're going to go ahead and let's do it like this. We're going to go ahead and comment this out because we don't really need it right now. And we'll go ahead and we'll add a line here for email. So we'll say Jane's email equals jane@madisoncollege.edu, and John's email is john@madisoncollege.edu. All right, now we'll use the toString magic method, and we'll say echo, and I'll put in bold Jane, and then we'll put a colon. Oops, let's try that, and a colon, and then we'll say another break, okay, and then let's see if I got that right, and then I'm going to just say, just like you would do in Java, if you just echo out the name of the object, you are good to go. Okay, so that's Jane, and then let's do John. We'll change that to John. We'll say John Okay, now if we have no bugs, that's going to work. If we have bugs, we got to fix them. So let's go ahead and hit return and check it out. I got Jane, ID of 5, name Jane, email Jane at madisoncollege.edu, John with an ID of 1000, name John, email John at madisoncollege.edu. Excellent. So far, so good. So, I kind of have a question. Let's go back to the student magic right here. And I have a question for you. My question is this. Is it a good idea to directly use the instance variables? Yeah, the instance variables. What do you think? Let's just say, for grins and giggles, that this is a social security number, okay, or this ID has some, you don't want everybody to see what the ID is. So let's say in the getter, I decide to do something like this, okay, and maybe you have a special getter that only an admin can use or something like that. All right, and again, this is just a simple example. So I'll put right here in the top of the getter, I'll say if $ivar equals ID, we want to return. Now we're not going to change the value of ID. We're just going to return 1, 2, 3, 4 asterisks. Okay. Now, because I'm directly using the directly accessing the instance variables, nothing's going to change, right? So what I need to do is I need to modify this. So I'm using the here, I'll go ahead and copy that. I need to modify this so I'm using the magic getters and setters. Okay, we'll do that. Okay, so what do I have to change? I think all I got to change is this will be, oh yes, underscore get. Oh. Okay, and I'll just copy that. And then that'll be close the string and put the closing parentheses. Yep. And we'll do that here as well. And if that worked, then now we're cooking with gas here. Okay. So one other thing I want to say about the problem with magic getters and setters, and all of the problems that I have to do with just the magic getters and setters. I don't have a problem with the magic constructor destructor. I don't have a problem with the magic toString. Okay, those are pretty sound. But one problem is when you use these magic getters and setters, there's a problem that I like to call it's the problem of mutability versus immutability. Okay, now the definition of mutability is I can change it, versus something that is immutable is something that I cannot change. So you might learn as you grow in your development skills as a professional developer. Good class design is such that when you design a class, you want to design a class in such a way that the instance variables that do not need to change, you want them to be immutable, and they only get initialized to the values you want at construction. Let me see if I can give you a word picture sort of as an example. Let's say you wanted to create a class that presented a volume in X, Y, and Z dimensions, 3 dimensions, X, Y, and Z. And the functionality of that class allowed you to understand what's the constraints. Okay, assuming we started at 0, so how big is the x-axis, how big is the y-axis, and how big is the z-axis? What's the extents or the constraints of the axes? Good class design will say that you want those values set at initialization, but you don't want the user of the class to be able to change them. If you needed to be able to change those extents, you would require the user to instantiate a brand new volume object. Now, the only thing you do want to change is, let's say you want to keep one or more points of location inside that volume. So that's just going to be an XYZ axis that can change maybe over time of the life of that object. So what you have in that particular case is you have an object where some of the instance variables are mutable and some of the instance variables are immutable. Here's the problem with magic getters and setters. It's an all or nothing proposition. If you use them, that means all of your instance variables are now mutable. Unless you decide you're going to do some magic inside of your magic methods and say, hey, if this IVAR is ID, or let's say it's X, Y, and Z extents for volume, you can't set it. Okay, so we're getting really complicated at this point when we're trying to deal with good class design, when all we were trying to do is save us some time with a little bit of syntactic sugar. Okay, that in and of itself is a reason that nobody should use these. Okay, you have to decide for yourself, but my opinion is that these things are not even quite half-baked and shouldn't be used. There's also other problems that have to do with inheritance, and they do not work across inheritance very well at all. Okay, so enough said about that. Let's go to the subject of construction. Okay, so let's say we want to create a constructor. All right, so usually you're going to put your constructors at the top. Okay, and in PHP we have constructors and destructors, and oftentimes in a language like Java or PHP that has a garbage collector, you don't really see the destructor used that often. You may use it if, for example, you're trying to free up some file resource or some database resource, which again, more often than not, those things will free up when the object goes out of scope. Okay, so constructor. They work very similar to how you understand them in Java. Okay, so if this is not defined, if the constructor is not defined, then PHP creates a default constructor, just like Java. If you create one, let's do this. If you create one, PHP will not create a default constructor. All right, what does it look like? Simple. Well, you need the function keyword. Function construct. Okay. So here, let's do a quick example. And how do we know this thing is running? We'll say something like this: echo building a student. So if we go and run this, we'll see we're building a student. So we know our constructor is being called. Okay, great. Let's do this. Let's modify. Of course, I forgot the public. By default, it's going to be public. All right, so let's go ahead and modify this. And we'll do this. We're going to, it seems to me that it's probably legitimate that once you construct one of these, you're going to know what the student ID is and you don't want to change it. You want the ID to be immutable. Unfortunately, it's not immutable because we have a magic setter. So we're just not going to worry about that right now, and we'll just put an ID in here. Okay. So then how do we set this? Well, we probably want to say $this double underscore set ID $ID. Okay. All right. And then what we're going to want to do is we need to modify use student magic. And let's see, we're going to change this to 7. And we'll change this, well, hold on. Edit, redo. Oops, okay. Let's change this to, let's change this to 7 and this to 8. We'll comment this out, uncomment this. Now we know this isn't going to work, right? So I don't even know why I did that. None of that's going to work, right? We'll change it back to 5 and 6 because that's what it was. And let's go instead, we'll put 7 and 8 in here. And I think that's all we have to do. So then let's refresh. And I've got an error on line 23. Undefined variable J. Line 23. What? Oh, that's why. All right, let's try again. And if I just uncomment this code in the magic method so you can see that actually in fact worked, we'll uncomment this blanking out stuff right here. Rerun that. And now you can see that works as expected. Okay, so let's go ahead and here's what I'm going to do. As I have been doing, I'm going to go ahead and we just delete this folder right here, move to trash, and then I'll go out to week 3. I'm going to go ahead and compress this into week3.zip file. I will post that up to the course documents section in Blackboard. So then you have everything that that I created for this evening. All right. Okay, so that concludes our screencast lecture for week 3. I know it's a little short, but that's okay. That's all we need to cover today. Do not forget that at the Friday of this week by midnight, the first project is due. That's a very simple project. Really, it should probably take you no more than 15-20 minutes to bang out, really, in my opinion. Next week, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to cover reference types as instance variables, which I think should be reviewed at least from what you should have learned in Java and what you should be using if you're taking advanced Java. And then the second part is going to be inheritance. And, you know, again, it's still kind of review, and then we'll start in on some new stuff in the following week. All right. I hope I would like to say or reiterate, if you have anything you want me to address in a following screencast, please include it as in the feedback channel, and I would be happy to address that. All right. Until the next screencast, take care.